All right. So once again, welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We're just going to let folks trickle in a little bit as we get started here. If you haven't already, please do drop your name, pronouns, agency, and role in the chat. You've probably already seen that this session will be recorded as well, so you can share it with your team afterwards. And while you're introducing yourselves, we'll go ahead and introduce who we are. My name is Layla Dost. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a program officer with JDI or Just Detention International, also a former rape crisis center advocate. And I will pass over to Jenica.
The envelopes?
And a reminder to please mute yourself during the session. Thank you.
Sounds like someone's getting ready to write some letter to incarcerated folks. Hi folks, my name is Jenica Sinor. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a project manager at Valor. I'm super excited to see folks trickle in and yeah, excited to get started today. So we'll talk a little bit about Valor or Valor US first. Formerly known as the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault or CalCASA. Our mission is that we're committed to preventing and ending sexual violence and advancing equity, by advancing equity and eradicating oppression. We provide leadership, vision, and resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities that are committed to ending sexual violence. Ultimately, what we envision is a world free from violence, where the dignity of every person is valued and respected.
And again, I'm here today with Just Detention International, or JDI for short, and we are a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. And we carry out that mission by working with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates such as yourselves, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe, promoting public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention, and supporting incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. And JDI's core principle is that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. No matter what crime someone has committed, rape is not part of the penalty. And California Advancing PREA is a partnership between JDI and Valor funded by the California Office of Emergency Services, or Cal-OES. Through this collaboration, we hope to provide local rape crisis centers with the resources and support that they need to establish and provide a full range of services to incarcerated survivors in our state. I'll pass back over to Jenica.
And then just a bit of housekeeping. Edward's already on it chat. Edward's part of our JDI Valor California Advancing PREA team here. To feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat or any comments. We're talking about setting up services here, but I know we also have a lot of folks that have set up services and have established services and maybe looking for some refreshers or different ideas or whatnot. But we love a good comment section or a good chat, lively chat. So if you have any questions, or if you're like, yeah, that worked really well for my agency, would love to hear from folks. So we'll go over some of our objectives today. Our first objective here is that we'll hopefully you'll be leaving this session understanding the basics of U.S. incarceration and sexual abuse in detention. We'll be providing an overview of the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA. And we'll also be exploring how your agency can center incarcerated survivors and discuss approaches to setting up confidential services in a detention setting. Before we get started, though, we are going to be talking about sexual violence. We are going to be talking about the inherent trauma of incarceration and violence of incarceration. So please feel free to take care of yourself however you need to, and whatever that looks like for you as an individual. If you want to have your camera off, if you need to take a breather, if you want to make sure, if you're, some folks if you're working from home, maybe go shift gears and sit on the couch for a minute and just kind of be able to listen. Um, if that makes sense for you. Um, just whatever you need to take care of yourselves. We will take a couple breaks, so know that that is coming up as well. But whatever you need to do. And then we will be using person first language instead of saying terms like inmates or I mean, inmates is the one that we hear most common, or prisoners. We often will say people who are incarcerated or survivors.
All right. So, with a nod to this incarcerated person's artwork, we're going to begin with a helicopter view of incarceration in the United States and talk briefly about the issues of sexual abuse of people in detention. And just a reminder, if you could please mute yourself, that would be appreciated. All right, so the US doesn't have one criminal justice system. Instead, we have thousands of federal, state, local, and tribal systems. There are an overwhelming number of facilities in the United States, and in fact, these systems hold almost 2 million people. And there are variations in how these facilities are run, but what they have in common is that people held in them are not free to leave. And sometimes there can be a lot of confusion about the difference between these type of facilities, in particular, the difference between jails and prisons. I know some of you are seasoned PREA advocates here with us today, but some of you all are newer. If anyone has some ideas about what are the main differences between jails and prisons, feel free to share that in the chat, or if you want to come off mute and share that, please do so. Anything that comes to mind on the differences between a jail and a prison? Yeah, absolutely. Someone shared that jail is typically less than a year and prison is usually a longer stay of over a year. Jails are typically shorter sentences. Anyone else have any ideas? So one of the reasons that the a person stays in prison longer is that once a person is in prison, that's post conviction, whereas most folks in jails are pre-trial detainees. They have not yet been convicted. They're waiting for trial. Yes, absolutely. Some prisons are privatized. That is very true. And jails are typically run by the county compared to prisons, which are state run or federally run. And then, of course, there are the privatized prisons, as mentioned. All right. Well, thank you so much for responding to that. And we'll dive a little more deeply into some of the differences. So, just like we mentioned, some of the key distinctions between jails and prisons are that in California, jails are typically run by local law enforcement, usually a sheriff's department, usually at the county level, but it can also be run at the city level. Also, there are tribal jails. And this is different from the prison system, which is run by either the state government. So in California, that would be a CDCR facility, or the federal government, which is under the Bureau of Prisons. The oversight for jails is typically locally based and it's usually quite limited, while the oversight for prisons in California is the Office of the Inspector General, or OIG. And that office is responsible for overseeing what happens inside California state prisons and should work to address the mishandling of incidents of sexual abuse within correctional facilities. As mentioned, prisons hold people who have been convicted of a crime, whereas most people in jail have not been tried or convicted, and they are there awaiting trial. Often it's folks that couldn't make bail, didn't have the resources, to bail out of jail, so they were being held before trial. And that's why the length of stay is much shorter in a jail versus a prison system. Folks in jail, as someone mentioned in the chat, are usually there for less than a year, and most people in prison are there for more than a year. The length of stay in a jail system may be short, but people do tend to cycle more frequently in and out of the jail system, unfortunately. And unlike prisons, where there tends to be more robust programming and movement for those incarcerated through the facility or on the yard, jails tend to have significantly less programming available and are much more restrictive in terms of the movement allowed. So folks don't have the same ability to move around as much. There's usually a lot less opportunity for recreation or common spaces, and almost no programming or classes or groups. So thinking again about how our criminal justice system holds almost 2.3 million people in detention, we wanted to note that the US incarcerates people at a higher rate than any other country in the world. And you'll note from this graphic that most people are housed in state prisons. And similarly, in the state of California, most people are housed in state prisons and local jails. And there are also huge racial disparities in terms of who is locked up in our detention facilities. Black people are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white people. Latina people are incarcerated at 2 times, and Indigenous people 4 times the rate of their white counterparts. And that's a vital piece of information to keep in mind when we're thinking about the relationship between racism and mass incarceration. And that disparity only grows when we look closer to home here in California. The disparity gap here is wider than the national average and places our state among the top 10 US states with the highest Black-white differential for incarceration. Many incarcerated people have a history of complex trauma. For example, they're likely to have experienced sexual and or other kinds of abuse as children or youth, adult sexual assault, intimate partner violence or relationship violence, human trafficking, gang violence, and or police violence. People who are incarcerated are twice as likely to be survivors of previous sexual or domestic violence or child abuse, and more than half of all incarcerated people have a mental health diagnosis. In addition to all of this, people who are incarcerated also have often faced extreme poverty and have had limited access to resources. They may also have been made to feel that because of who they are or what they've done, available support services were not meant for them. Advocates who serve incarcerated people may be one of the first sources of help for them along their healing journeys. So we're so glad, once again, that you're here joining us today to talk about setting up these essential services for incarcerated survivors. Until relatively recently, there was little data on sexual abuse in detention. And according to an estimate by a lead researcher at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS, roughly 200,000 people are sexually abused in US prisons and jails each year. And that figure represents the number of people, not the number of incidents of sexual abuse. And it doesn't include sexual harassment either, which is rampant. And we often note that sexual harassment can escalate into abuse. The majority of survivors are abused not once, but repeatedly in facilities. And there's every reason for us to believe that this formal data only represents the tip of the iceberg and that the actual incidence of sexual abuse in detention is much, much greater. So sexual abuse in detention exists on a continuum of violence, from sexual harassment to rape and some forms of sexual abuse like protective pairing and abusive searches that are more specific to detention settings. As advocates, you all are familiar with sexual harassment as a form of sexual violence. And again, we know that harassment can often escalate into sexual assault. Protective pairing may be something you're less familiar with in your work in the community. We don't really hear that or experience that. So I wanted to throw this back to folks as a question. What do you think protective pairing means? Feel free to share that in the chat. What comes to mind when you think of protective pairing as an abuse dynamic? And it's totally okay not to know. Absolutely. Someone mentioned similar to survival sex, only being in a relationship with someone for protection against others. Absolutely. That is very on point. Person becomes a couple just so they have someone to have their back. Absolutely. Yes. Really great responses. Protective pairing refers to an arrangement in which a person with more power offers to protect an incarcerated person with less power in exchange for sex and other services. And often we see that that situation can develop into sex trafficking. We also want to briefly talk about how domestic violence, intimate partner violence, or IPV, or the name that we've used on the slide here, relationship violence, may look different in detention. Physical affection and touch between incarcerated people is prohibited and a rule violation in custody, and staff members often wrongly mistake consensual affection and touch between incarcerated people as relationship violence. And then on the other hand, many facility staff members are unequipped to identify the signs of relationship violence and fail to prevent and disrupt violence and abuse within romantic relationships inside. And similarly to non incarcerated survivors, survivors of relationship violence in detention are often forced to have ongoing contact with their perpetrators. Sometimes certain types of abuse, such as protective pairing, like we discussed, and IPV, can appear consensual at first glance. But a really good gauge in your advocacy work to measure the survivor's willingness or capacity to say yes or no is asking, would this person agree to do this on the outside? And more often than not, the answer is no. Perpetrators of abuse are looking to get away with abusing and harassing others, and they'll usually single out people who are not likely to be taken seriously when explaining their needs or reporting their abuse. They'll also single out people who are perceived to be weaker or less credible and who are more likely to be blamed for an abuser's actions. And this is why people who have experienced prior abuse, people with disabilities, people suffering from mental illness, and people in the LGBTQ plus community are often targeted for abuse. It's important to keep in mind this is not because of who they are, but this is rather because of the way that others treat people who identify with these groups. And I won't dive into the rates of abuse in all these groups. We do have specialized trainings that do talk more about who is targeted for this abuse, and I'd be happy to share that data on an individual level as well. But we can dive into that in a future training. In terms of who perpetrates sexual abuse in detention, we know that there are nearly equal rates of sexual abuse perpetrated by staff and incarcerated people in adult facilities. In juvenile facilities, over 82% of victimized youth are abused by staff. And when we say staff, that includes security staff like corrections officers, as well as contractors, which might include those who work in food service, mental health, medical, maintenance, education, administration, as well as volunteers, basically anyone who gets to leave the facility at the end of the day. Is that information surprising to anybody, hearing that the rates of abuse between staff and incarcerated people and their peers is almost equal? And also, while you think about that, why do you think there's no such thing as a consensual relationship between staff and incarcerated people? Feel free to share in the chat. Why can an incarcerated person not provide consent? Power, absolutely. Someone else said staff are in a position of authority because of the power dynamic, use of power, absolutely. Yes. Slide, please. Absolutely. So just as many of you brought up, staff and incarcerated people can never be in an equal relationship because of the inherent power differential. Because of that power dynamic, there is no such thing as consensual sex between an incarcerated person and a staff member, and any such contact is always considered abuse. PREA, or the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and applicable laws recognize that it is impossible for a person in custody to meaningfully agree to sexual contact with staff. Staff have ultimate power over those who are incarcerated, regardless of the age of that incarcerated person. And this power includes every aspect of an incarcerated person's life, from when someone can go to programming, if they can eat, whether they have visits with their family. Even if the incarcerated person states that they consented, lies about the situation during an interview, or refuses to cooperate with the investigation, the incarcerated survivor or resident is a survivor of abuse and cannot in any way be held responsible for that abuse. And throughout our trainings, we do like to center the voices of incarcerated survivors. And here we're sharing a quote from Ivory, who is a survivor of sexual abuse by staff. He says, "Often people think that you deserve whatever happens to you in prison because you have committed a crime. But no one should be sexually assaulted by an officer. Inmates have no power to protect themselves, so we rely on the officers to make it a safe environment." And that really underscores that power dynamic that we were talking about and the role of staff in protecting incarcerated people. And with that, I will pass back over to Jenica.
Thanks, Layla. So in this section, we're going to be going over PREA, or the Prison Rape Elimination Act. It is a civil law that requires that corrections facilities, so that's jails, prisons, federal, state prisons, youth detention facilities, ICE facilities, take concrete steps to protect people in custody from sexual abuse, whether it's perpetrated by staff or another incarcerated person. PREA requires that facilities adopt a zero tolerance policy and approach to sexual abuse. The PREA standards affirm that it is the absolute responsibility of the corrections agencies to protect incarcerated people in their custody from sexual abuse. And at the same time, the standards recognize that there's the importance of outside agencies in supporting these efforts. So at its most basic level, PREA's purpose is to eliminate sexual abuse in corrections and law enforcement, or in corrections facilities, detention facilities, and to increase the accountability of detention agencies, and to give incarcerated survivors the same level of care as those that are in the community. PREA's aim is to keep people safe. There are more than 50 individual standards that they're all intended to do one of three things: to prevent sexual abuse, to detect sexual abuse that they can't prevent, and to respond to abuse with a sense of urgency and centering the needs of the survivor. This could look like separating perpetrators from survivors, providing survivors multiple ways to report the abuse that they have experienced, giving survivors access to appropriate emergency and ongoing medical and mental health care, increase staff and agency accountability, and provide access to rape crisis services and emotional support services from rape crisis centers. We talk about the multiple ways to report. So survivors should be able to report to a trusted staff member or contractors or volunteers within the facility itself. They can report to third parties. They can report to what's called an outside reporting entity, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. They can do it verbally or in writing, and they can also do this anonymously. Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of a kind of quiz about PREA. Some of these things might feel like trick questions, or they might be issues that we haven't covered. No worries about getting it wrong, right or wrong. We'll just figure it out together. So first, and so you can do this in the chat if you'd like. would be, yeah, best case scenario. Who must be in compliance with the PREA standards? Who's ultimately responsible to make sure? Yeah, them, the correction agency. Yep, totally. Oops, I want it. There we go. Detention centers and rape crisis centers. So rape crisis centers can help support survivors, and we can work in collaboration with the detention facility to make sure that they are in compliance. But, and of course, like that's a really integral part of all of our roles. But there can sometimes be an energy with correction centers or detention facilities where they want to say like, well, they'll want to put it off on someone else, and it's ultimately their responsibility. We can support them in that, but it's their job to make sure folks are safe. Okay, so next question. Do advocates have to report abuse that happens in a detention facility? I see if the survivors want us to report it. Mhm. Victim voice and victim choice. Only if the survivor wants us to. Yes and no, Emily. Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. Yes and no, only reporting within our mandated reporting requirements. Yes, and so I like how you said like our mandated reporting requirements. So only the rape crisis centers mandated reporting requirements. Prisons and jails will often try to say like, no, you're a mandated reporter. You have to report these things, and you as a victim advocate, your rights supersede that their confidential, or I'm sorry, their reporting guidelines. So your rights as a victim advocate means that you don't have to report it. The only exception to that is if you're at a youth facility, it looks a little bit different. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that, Emily. But otherwise, only if requested by the survivor. Oops. And then, do the PREA standards address abuse that happened prior to incarceration? We see folks saying yes, that they want to be examined. A couple folks saying no, but support can still be offered. Yeah, Emily, thank you for highlighting that. Yeah. So the way that this is phrased is a little funky, and I apologize about that. But so folks are entitled to services, to emotional support, to advocacy, even if it happened prior to uh, their time, at the detention facility. If Andy said if they want to be examined, if like an assault happened within the forensic exam timeline, that like 3 to 5 days depending on the situation, as they were being booked, then yeah, an exam could totally happen. I think after that it looks a little bit different, but they are still entitled to services. They're still entitled to support and advocacy if they're wanting to file a report. um it just gets a little tricky. Okay, and this last question, does PREA address sexual harassment too? So yeah, see a bunch of yeses. Yep, absolutely. PREA includes sexual harassment as well. So if they're being harassed by another incarcerated person, if they are being harassed by a staff member, being retaliated against by a staff member, absolutely. Okay, and then next we're going to transition into watching a video about Rodney's experience. And I think Layla's going to be sharing screen here. Yeah, thanks everyone.
So angry with myself because I felt like I didn't fight back. I didn't do anything. You can't look in the mirror because you're ashamed of what happened. You're ashamed of what you feel you let happen. Disassociated. The physical pain was not even a comparison to what just had happened to me. There was also a thought of that it's over. It was every time I was thinking that, oh, it's over. This is just the last. Just get over with. My goal was to get out of the entire situation. Already in prison, it's a very emotionally trying thing. Very emotionally trying. You're away from your family, you're away from a lot of things. But this going through prison and being raped is even more isolating. So you can't talk to anyone in some of the places that I've been. The counselors and they're not trained for. They're not trained to understand this. They're trained for pretty much suicide prevention. In the state, I saw a counselor once that wanted to know what my plan was when I left. So the more focus is getting back out and getting yourself together. So who do you talk to? Initially, I wrote JDI 13-page letter, and they responded with a lot of information for me. The information let me know, look, there are places to help you in this world, and here are some of them. We are also one from just my first time writing JDI up until today has always been that therapy, just having someone to listen to what I rant about and how I feel about what's going on, what's went on. It isn't your fault. If you're not the only one that happens to, and we understand. Sometimes even so today I blame myself for this. Sometimes. And so to hear someone constantly tell you, you need that reminder because if you're dealing with it yourself, you know, I'm a step from the ledge. No one deserves this. No one deserves for their body, their mind, their sexuality. No one deserves that to be ripped from them because they committed a crime.
So we'll end this right before our break here with another quote from Rodney. And say, this was, in a word, enslavement. My body no longer belonged to me, but to someone else, to my husband, a rapist who controlled my life with the constant threat of violence. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, take a breather, get some water, whatever you need. And we'll be back at 1:42. Okay, thanks, folks.
All right, if folks want to start trickling back in. All right, we'll get back going here. So now that we've discussed some of the PREA standards, let's discuss what can be done to create internal protocol at your respective rape crisis centers to serve incarcerated survivors. And throughout this, we can keep in mind that small changes can make a big difference. It can be hard to focus on our work with incarcerated survivors if that work is not being integrated into the agency as a whole. So, one of the things that we can do to help sustain a solid PREA program at our agency is to create habits. And there's some different ways that this can look, such as having regular staff meetings and making sure that there's space for you to talk about your PREA program and services at those meetings. And it could just be a brief check-in, even to say that, we haven't gotten calls from the facilities or there haven't been any accompaniments, just letting the agency know that there hasn't been changes, but just keeping that topic alive at the agency meetings and, centering that again in the work that you do with incarcerated survivors. You definitely want to try to have regular times where you contact staff at the correctional facilities that you serve and be sure to document your outreach attempts and your communication with facility staff. And that could be weekly check-ins, monthly, quarterly, whatever seems to work best with your relationship with the facilities you work with. Sometimes it can be really hard to get a hold of staff at the facility. Folks are away from their desk. There may not be a big email culture at the facility, but just something that keeps that communication open, keeps that conversation alive, making sure, they know what's going on with your agency, keeping abreast of any changes at their facility, staff changes, protocol changes, any needs that the incarcerated population might have that might be changing. And with those regular check-ins, that can be an opportunity to talk about testing the phone lines, being sure to test that the hotline is working on a regular basis, confirming confidential mail handling practices, and keeping aware of any changes with forensic exam protocol, any changes with location of the forensic exams as well. And keeping those meetings and contacts regular will help keep them sustainable, even if the individual positions at your agency change and grow. Making your PREA work and ongoing conversation at your agency can really help us make the space and have the energy to keep pushing to get in the door at the facilities you're working with. And you can, get more staff on board to do that PREA work, have that training, and have that awareness. If you haven't already, while you're integrating PREA advocacy work at your agency, be sure to review your agency's policies to ensure that the language is inclusive of incarcerated survivors. You can also take a look at your intake forms and see if there's any changes that might be needed, such as, is there space for you to check off that the survivor is incarcerated? Is there a line where you can write where they are incarcerated, what their inmate number is, whether they were assaulted or harassed by staff or another incarcerated person or a person prior to being detained? And we'll take a more in-depth look at what this might look like in our upcoming April 1st webinar about providing services to incarcerated survivors as well. It's also important to review your agency policy around working with survivors who have caused harm or perpetrated abuse. Does your agency also serve survivors who have harmed others? And if you do not, do you have resources that can be shared with the survivor without taking them on as a client, or referrals to other organizations in the community which may be able to help? Something else that RCCs have done is to create a manual that outlines best practices for their PREA program. And that manual might always be subject to change as you learn and grow and your understanding of the PREA standards expands, but it can just be a resource for identifying best practices for serving incarcerated survivors and expanding those services. A manual like that can be super helpful when there's staff turnover, when someone gets promoted or leaves the PREA advocate role, just to ensure that that PREA advocate's work has not been lost and they can pass that on to the next person taking on that role. And slide, please. Job descriptions for victim advocates should also include language around serving incarcerated survivors, even if the job description is not for a designated PREA advocate. Advocates who answer hotline calls and respond to forensic exams or letters will eventually be providing support to incarcerated survivors. So it's really important that this is highlighted in job descriptions, just in the same way we would highlight working with young survivors, LGBTQ plus survivors, or male survivors. And as for PREA advocates who work closely with the facility, it's important that they feel confident facilitating trainings, not only for RCC staff, but also for correctional staff. If you're not sure if language like this is included in job descriptions at your agency, it might be worth checking in with your management team or administrative team to ensure that it is going forward. And now that we've developed an understanding of what it looks like to build up internal practices and protocol to support incarcerated survivors, let's talk about how you can begin setting up victim services in your local detention facilities. So PREA requires that incarcerated survivors are provided access to emotional support services. These services that you all provide to survivors are absolutely vital. And often there are no services within prison and jail systems, or mental health services that are available are not appropriate for those who have experienced sexual violence. And we have another survivor quote for you. This is Troy. Troy was abused by a fellow youth at a juvenile facility. He was forced to provide sexual favors to an older boy who promised to protect him from others, but didn't. Troy is now free and he is a member of JDI's Survivor Council, but this abuse was extremely traumatic for him. And as he puts it, being attacked and not receiving support from the adults in charge turned my world upside down. I take that with me wherever I go. Troy's quote really speaks to the long-lasting impact of trauma and the importance of advocates providing trauma-informed and survivor-centered care to help support and empower survivors along their healing journey. So the MOU between corrections agencies and RCC should lay out all the services the jail or prison will facilitate and what services the Rape Crisis Center will provide. And that should include, at a minimum, accompaniments to medical forensic exams and investigatory interviews, confidential, unmonitored, free hotline calls, and confidential written correspondence. You can add additional services on later based on your agency capacity, but those are the essential services that your RCC should aim to provide with the facility. The MOU can be a lengthy process, a complex process to enter into, but it's often the proving ground for building the relationship between your agency and the prison or jail. And we do have an MOU template I'm going to drop into the chat that you all can take a look at as a resource. And JDI and Valor, we're always happy to look over MOUs as well if you have questions around the MOU process. I'm also dropping in the PREA standards that outline some of those essential emotional support services that your agency would be able to provide. And slide, please. So to get things started out here, we would like to turn things back over to you. What are some things your agency has done or can do internally to prepare to provide services in detention? And you might just be getting started. You might just be getting information on this training, which is wonderful. We welcome that. We are glad you're here. So just anything that comes to mind on what your agency is already doing, or maybe something that you're preparing to do to prepare to provide services in detention. Don't be shy, y'all. All right, thanks. Somebody mentioned we just created an account with prepaid funds so that people who are incarcerated can access crisis counseling over the phone. Wonderful. I'm really glad that you helped set that up and support that to get some more access. Someone else said meet with jail staff to answer questions they often have. Yeah, absolutely. Having those regular meetings with jail staff, making sure that communication is open, you can answer their questions, they can answer yours. That's super powerful. Anyone else have anything they'd like to share? Just like where you're at, where your agency's at. We have the prisons on our SAR team. Great. I'm really glad to hear that they're at the table for those conversations. Awesome. Cool. Well, if anyone has anything else they'd like to drop in the chat, please feel free to do so. If not, we will move along. All right. So, really quick, someone else in the chat. We have a number of incarcerated people. We have a number of incarcerated people can access anytime that connects them directly to the crisis line. Great. Absolutely. They should have that access to your hotline. And I'm really glad to hear that that is working out. Okay. Thank you. So just like we mentioned in those essential services, confidential correspondence or letter writing, communication, counseling, all of that is super important. And having that confidentiality, I mean, that is core to the work that we do as advocates. So for those of us who are still working on getting buy-in from other facilities, here's some steps that you can take and think about. You definitely want to communicate the importance of confidentiality to the facility staff that you're working with. And you can do this by explaining the importance of confidentiality when providing trauma-informed care to sexual assault survivors. Confidentiality may have a different meaning to you compared to staff at a corrections facility. So you want to make sure you're on the same page on what that means and what that means specifically for your role as an advocate. And once you've got that buy-in, you want to figure out how the facility will make sure that letters are in fact confidential. For example, at state prisons, victim advocates and their clients utilize evidence code 1035.4, privileged communication outside of their letters. And this signals to mailroom staff that they are only to open mail in the presence of the recipient and that they're only checking for contraband. They're not reading the letter. However, that is specifically used for CDCR facilities. They all are on board with using that code 1035.4. That is not typically the case for county jails, even though the communication still falls under that same evidence code. So each jail facility might differ in how they handle confidential mail with your agency. So you're going to want to communicate that with the jail while you're setting up services, whether they'll be writing confidential on the mail, legal on the mail, whatever's going to ensure that confidential privilege is kept for the mail. And lastly, if that practice hasn't been included in the MOU, you want to definitely make sure that the MOU is updated to ensure that confidential correspondence. And there's an example of what writing that evidence code out on a letter might look like. So what kind of challenges might come up as you're advocating for confidential correspondence? There can often be resistance in setting up confidential services in correctional facilities. Staff have safety in mind, they have security in mind, and they often fear that contraband will be entering or leaving facility through letters. A lot of facilities around the country have moved towards almost entirely electronic mail because of that. But normally, mail between survivors and rape crisis centers is still paper, it's still confidential, it's not being scanned and uploaded. But that is the main concern of facilities around the confidential mail piece. A lot of facilities might also be unfamiliar with how to actually handle the confidential mail. Even though they're expected to treat it like legal mail, only open it in the presence of the survivor. And mailroom practices can vary widely from site to site. Correctional staff do experience a lot of staff turnover. So it's important that the PREA compliance manager, mailroom staff, and other staff that you're working with are knowledgeable about how confidential mail is managed in their facility. And you can always check in with the survivors that you're working with as well. Ask them, is the mail being opened in their presence? Ask them if that confidentiality is being practiced. And so what else can you do to make sure that the letters are being treated as confidential mail at all times? Again, during those regular conversations, those check-ins that you're having with staff, ask them, are the mailroom staff trained properly? Talk with the PREA compliance manager, the PREA coordinator, if there are any issues with letters being opened outside of the presence of the recipient, make sure that that gets addressed, make sure that that is clarified, and the best practices are going forward with that confidential treatment of mail. Again, checking in with your clients, making sure that mail is opened up only in front of them, it's not being read. And if they want you to advocate on their behalf, if they give consent to do so, talk with staff at the facility if something happened, if that mail was already opened, if that confidentiality is not being taken seriously at the facility, and talk with them about maybe if they want to report the situation, whether that feels safe for them to do so. There might be concerns around retaliation as well. And then we do have a reporting barriers form that would let our team know what issues might be going on as well. So if you're having an issue with your facility around confidential mail, I'm going to drop this in the chat. You can fill out this form and submit this to us. We'll be sharing our emails at the end of the presentation as well. So you can also just email either of us directly and just let us know, like, hey, this is going on. What can we do about it? I'd like to talk through it, and we would be here to support you as well. And I will pass things back over to Jenica.
Okay, so the first step in advocating for free, confidential, and unrecorded calls to your hotline is, stressing the importance of confidentiality to facility staff. Again, we talked about the PREA standards and how it's their obligation to provide these services and reduce those barriers to accessing those services. They have an obligation to provide survivors with access to you all as a resource. If you're contacted at the jail or at the prison, I mean, most prisons have it dialed in at this point for the most part. But especially if you're working with the county jail, if they're not sure how to set this up, it can be programmed through their phone provider. It's a little bit of a different process, I think, but people are able to speak with their lawyers confidentially as well. So it's not an impossible feat. A couple different challenges that can come up. It's not uncommon for posters, and you'll hear this a lot from facility staff as well. So if you have posters that are shared, and we have poster templates in case anybody needs, a starter poster, we can provide those for you. But it's not uncommon for posters advertising your services to be torn down. It could be that part of your offerings as you're establishing services is saying, hey, well, what if I come to your facility every other month and bring you a stack of flyers? Or what if we schedule a walkthrough every couple months and we replace those flyers together? could be one of the ways to get around that, and also, have your presence kind of known at the facility. Other challenges that can come up is that, while those calls should be confidential, sometimes the environment they're calling in isn't entirely private. It could be that it's in a communal space, or it could be that they're calling from a tablet, but there still are folks around, or maybe their connectivity with their tablet is making it a little difficult. There could also be time limits on phone calls. It could be that they have only 10 minutes on the phone call with you. So you're wanting to, get as much information in as possible. There's a number of different barriers that, come up when, supporting folks through the hotline. But, things can be put in place. So if you have a time limit on the phone call, they can call back and continue the phone call at another time. If you are with someone who, it's clear that they're maybe in a more public space, it could be that you say, okay, would you like me to ask you like yes or no questions, rather than asking them to like divulge really like sensitive information, letting them kind of guide how they want that phone call to go. We already started kind of talking about some of this, but some of the ways that you can ensure those confidential phone calls are happening are maybe coordinating test calls with the facility staff, making sure that those calls can happen from each phone or from each tablet. Maybe have staff confirm that the posters are up in place, or offer yourself to do a walkthrough. We also, while calls are supposed to be confidential, while calls are supposed to be unmonitored, we also want to talk with survivors about, information can travel. And while they're supposed to be confidential, while they're supposed to be unmonitored, you as an advocate can't guarantee every bit of confidentiality in that regard. And so, having them think about like what information they want to share, having them be, and they're already really aware of that. They know that they're monitored. They know that they are, that they don't have that privacy. So, ensuring they know that you're aware of that as well. We talked a little bit about, or we mentioned outside reporting agencies earlier. So an outside reporting agency is an entity that is, oftentimes it's like Crime Stoppers, or if it's a state prison, it's the Office of Inspector General. It's not you as a rape crisis center. It's another entity. So it's another agency that is supposed to be available to receive a PREA report from someone. Sometimes we hear from folks, from advocates saying, yeah, the person called me and they wanted to let me know this report happened, and they just wanted to like let me know. And oftentimes what's happening is someone is confusing your agency as the Rape Crisis Center with the outside reporting agency. For a county jail, if there isn't, a outside reporting agency established, that's something that maybe you guys can work on together. It's part of PREA compliance. So it's something that, maybe you can help them to identify. Yeah, Layla, thank you so much I see you, and they're dropping the links in the chat for the Office of Inspector General, if it's a CDCR facility. And then looks like the pre-fillable posters as well. Hold on one second, folks. My cat just decided to jump on screen with me. Let me get him off the desk. Also, we'll talk about a coordinated response plan. So a coordinated response plan is exactly what it sounds like. It is a plan, a protocol, a procedure that ensures that there are multiple folks involved in supporting survivors who, supporting survivors through their forensic exams, through investigations, through those follow-up services. It's required by PREA standard 115.64. This is a place where you can like really offer your skills as a survivor-centered and trauma-informed practitioner to, improve the facility's response to sexual abuse and harassment every step of the way. This is where you can bring up, if you're part of their coordinated response team and part of their SART. I know a couple people mentioned being part of MDTs and having folks be part of your SARTs. This is where you can really bring up those issues around medical forensic exams, investigations, and ensure that survivors are receiving those follow-up services, regardless of whether a report was like substantiated or not. And while this is a place where, while a coordinated response plan, a SART, a coordinated response team, and I know a lot of folks are familiar with this already, but really just want to reiterate it, especially as we're talking about folks within detention facilities. You must remain, maintain their confidentiality at all times, unless your clients explicitly stated that you can reveal their name and experience within that collective space. So if you haven't done so already, you'll want to identify where the facility takes, survivors for their sexual assault forensic exam. Ideally, it will happen at the same place that the other exams in your county do, so that it's just the same exam with the same examiners, the same processes. You also want to find out as much as you can about the coordinated response protocol that we mentioned earlier from the PREA compliance manager or the PCM or another, contact. Requesting an advocate for accompaniment should be part of that protocol overall. So investigatory interview accompaniments. We know that these accompaniments are they sometimes can feel like they're really rushed by the facility. They sometimes happen and maybe it's not rushed, but it's not, nobody lets an advocate know that it's happening. But investigatory interviews are oftentimes one of those things where it's really crucial to have an advocate available. And it's the time we see folks all the time say, well, they didn't call me for an interview. They didn't call me for an investigatory interview. And it's important, as you're establishing your services, as you are setting up your services, creating a plan between the facility and your agency to, know how to handle when an advocate needs to be dispatched to an investigatory interview to support a survivor. Facility staff should be trained to inform survivors that they have a right to a victim advocate during their interview and to call your RCC to accompany survivors during that interview. Excuse me. It's important to note that while sexual abuse investigations do require that the victim advocate is made available for survivors, sexual harassment investigations don't make it a requirement according to the PREA standards. As survivor-centered and trauma-informed practitioners, we know that best practice would be to ensure that advocates are made available for both types of investigations. This, will obviously require some relationship building and training for facility staff. And if the facility staff agree to this, then they would end up exceeding the PREA standards during their PREA audit, which we haven't talked a whole lot about, but PREA audits happen, I think, every 3 years, and is a chance for auditors to really see whether or not someone's being in compliance with PREA or not. And it's an opportunity for you as a agency to leverage that audit to improve upon those services. In the case that a victim advocate's not present during an investigation, it's important that at least at the minimum, facility staff provide the survivor with your RCC's materials and your contact information. An important part of making sure that services are well known and well used within a facility is marketing. You want to make sure that posters with your agency's contact information and services provided are available near phones and other, relevant common areas. The importance of, feedback from and word of mouth throughout the facility and, by the Inmate Advisory Council, if you're at a state prison, can't be stressed enough. Word of mouth goes a long way. Once people, begin to trust your services, once people get to know your agency, and receive the care that they are really, yearning for and really need, you'll likely begin to get more phone calls, get more letters, get more requests for services. Clients will be able to speak to, the ways that you're able to support them in their healing. This is again why it's so important that responses to letters are meaningful and personalized to each survivor, and that hotline responders are, able to confidently provide that emotional support, coping skills, and resources to survivors in detention. News travels super quick in detention settings. You can also, try to set up a time to talk to other staff, staff from other departments, whether it's like the mental health department, the intake staff, the PREA compliance manager, programming staff, and talk about like referrals, for your services. So maybe they interact with someone and that person starts talking about sexual abuse they had when they were a child and they want services, and it would be really helpful to be able to get that direct referral to you. Or at least have your pamphlets available so that they can provide that to the survivor and the survivor can reach out on their own terms. And then, yeah, thank you, Layla, for dropping those flyers in the chat. We have the youth fillable posters. So posters specifically for youth facilities. And then, oh yeah, we already included the one for county jails around hotlines and letter correspondence. Awesome. Okay, we are getting close to wrapping up and we'll have some time for some questions. But before we leave, we'll include some resources in the next slides here. But we just want to remind you of a couple things. Most importantly, you do have the skills to serve incarcerated survivors. You are experts in trauma. You are experts in validating survivors' experiences and ways to cope and heal. I know for folks that are starting their journey in supporting incarcerated survivors, it can sometimes feel really intimidating or really daunting because it can be a big undertaking. Systems aren't designed to provide support for survivors. But you have those skills. You have validating someone's experience goes so much farther than we can ever imagine. Incarcerated survivors rely on the strength of your relationship with the local facility for access. So make it as strong as possible. Think creatively. Finally, burnout is all too possible in this movement. Remember that systems change is incremental. It takes time, and we can just do our best, the best that we can right now, and the best that we can today. Okay, we're gonna drop a couple things in the chat. Layla with the links. I just thank you so much. The first is to Just Detention's website. So JDI has a number of different resources available on their website. And then Valor's website as well. We have all of our archived webinars for our projects. And then the PREA Resource Center. If you are really just itching to get into the nitty-gritty legal language around some of the PREA standards, the PREA Resource Center is a great spot to do that. And then we'll add this link to the chat as well. This webpage contains a number of recorded trainings that we've done historically at Valor and CalCasa, even when we were CalCasa and JDI as a team. This project's been around for 10 years. Isn't that pretty crazy? It's had a lot of different lives within those 10 years, but there's a number of different webinars and recorded, archived things. And then I'm going to delete mine, so it's just one link in there. And then if folks wouldn't mind, we also have a feedback survey that we would love to have folks fill out. It helps us know, how this is helpful, what works, what didn't work for this training, what, you'd like to see more of or less of as we plan trainings for the rest of the year. And then there's also a section at the bottom if, there are a lot of new names and new faces in the space. If you're interested in connecting with Valor and JDI as part of our TA that we offer and would like to strategize or talk more about like how you can implement services in your area, we would love to do that. So there's an area at the bottom if you want to include your email address, we'll reach out to you and schedule something. And we're kind of nerds for this stuff, so no question is too small, and we love being able to talk through different kinds of services and different strategies and help however we can. So I can drop that link in the chat. Yeah, the feedback form is super helpful. And then I'll stop recording, but do folks have questions or things that really resonated with them? Or yeah, what are folks feeling?